Salutations gamers, I'm the OgichiGame, and welcome back to Art Advice with Mr. Game. First of all, I'd like to apologize for the long wait on this episode. It should have come out much sooner than it has. However, I've been dealing with quite a few things, and also I've been trying to figure out the best way to proceed with how I would like to structure each of these videos. I have decided upon breaking up all of the separate pieces of the body and discussing each one. So basically, today we're going to be discussing rough work, or construction, or grouping, or whatever you want to call it, as it is the basis for everything that I'm going to be talking about in future videos, as far as how to actually draw pieces of the body. That includes things like hands, feet, the torso, the head, and of course we'll be touching on things after that. But to give you an idea of how to do each of those different parts, you're going to need to understand how to do rough work, which is what we're going to be talking about today. So I'll give an example on screen right here. So rough work is basically what you draw up. A lot of artists refer to it as construction. I, for many years, called it something called boning and bubbling. It can also be called grouping, or just rough work if you prefer. It doesn't really matter what you call it, honestly, because it's just a method for which that you create the groundwork for what you're about to draw. The best way that I can explain how you want to design your rough work, and apologies if I'm kind of stuttering a bit, I'm doing this off the cuff at the moment just from some notes. The best way that you can think about doing a rough work or construction is that you want to break down the individual components into groups, which is why I referred to it as boning and bubbling. The first thing that you want to do, especially when working with a character design, is you want to outline the bone structure. This is generally done with sort of this kind of stickman-esque sort of thing that just sort of outlines where the bones of, the character will be. You might use circles to outline particular joint points and that sort of thing. And then, as far as filling out the rest of the construction, this is where I called the part of it bubbling for many years, which is basically you're going to draw out sort of bubbles. They're not always bubbles, but you're going to draw out these shapes which define certain groupings of muscles and also groupings of how bones are going to affect the shape of the human body. And there's a few things to keep in mind when discussing how bones and the structure of the human body works. There's a rule, a very old trick, a very old rule called the triangle rule, or at least I call it the triangle rule. It's a very simple rule which states that when drawing a man's going to have a triangle facing downwards, and a woman's going to have a triangle facing upwards. And what that means is that a man's shoulders are going to be broader and a woman's hips are going to be wider, and that's very simple. The reason being, obviously men were built to be stronger, women built for birthing, that sort of thing. It just goes back to, the history of mankind, how we're designed differently. So the bone structure in men and women in that way are different. So hips are going to be wider on women, shoulders are going to be wider on men. So you have a triangle facing downwards, obviously the bottom of that triangle at the top representing the broader shoulders, the triangle at the bottom representing wider hips on women. That's the basics of the triangle rule anyway. It's not something that you necessarily always have to draw in. As far as how much you want to draw, as far as your rough work, draw as much as you think you're going to need. You don't have to outline every single muscle grouping unless you're really trying to remember all those muscle groupings because you're drawing a really muscular character, which oftentimes I like to do, draw really, really shredded characters just because I think it's kind of fun. But if you're not doing that, then you can just sort of make more general groupings. Maybe you're drawing a much fatter character, and so maybe they don't have much muscle at all showing through, and so in that sense you'd have to do the groupings a bit differently. It would still be based off of bones and muscle groups, but at the same time it'd be a lot flabbier, and you'd have to probably bubble in certain areas where there are now fat groupings as well. And as far as things being exact, do not worry about things being exact. In fact, the example of me drawing up just some general rough work on screen right now, it's not exact, and I'll go back later, and when I start to detail things in, I'm going to iron out a lot of these things where things are uneven that I notice, or where things I feel are too large, or too small, or need to be bigger, or whatever it needs to be. Do not worry so much about things being exact, like the groupings being exact. Just get out as much as you can. Just make sure that what you have gives you a good idea of where you're going to go. So don't worry about being exact at all. We're going to detail it in later. And when we do go about detailing in later, things like your hands, your head, all that sort of stuff, once you start working on those parts of the body and getting all those details ironed out, just remember to be very patient, and don't be afraid to redraw or even rework entire major areas. Now, in traditional art, if you were doing this on pen and paper, if you were doing this on canvas, obviously there is some limitations to how much you can rework or redraw. In digital art, if you're doing it digitally like I am right here, you don't have to worry about that at all. If you wanted to rework entire major parts, it's not going to be a big problem, generally, unless you're very late into it. So you don't want to wait until you're very late into the painting, obviously, but once you're still working on just line work and rough work, those are the places where you can rework those major areas. Make sure that you do that well in advance, so that so you don't run into the issue that you're all the way down the road where you're drawing in textures at this point, right? You've well past gone the value, you've well past gone the colors, you've well past gone in the shading and all this stuff, and now you're actually working on like skin textures and things like that on the painting. You don't want to reach that point and then realize you have a major flaw. So do not at all be worried about reworking your line work at all. In fact, I do it constantly, where I'll draw an entire, maybe I'll draw an entire arm only to realize that the proportions are off somewhere. Maybe the arm is too long in certain sections, or it just looks wrong, and I'll just sometimes completely scrap that arm entirely and redraw it from the ground up. Don't be afraid to do that. It happens, and it's better that you do it during the rough. It's better that you do it during the sketching, where you're actually getting the line work in, than it is that you do that later down the road. And that's about all I wanted to talk about and touch on today. As I said, we're going to be discussing in depth more of the individual components, such as, I believe probably next time we do this, I'm going to be discussing how to draw a head, how to get the certain groupings in the face right, because there are actual groupings, parts of the face that you need to be aware of, and where they are and how they affect the structure of the face in order to get the face structure right. You may have heard, if you've ever taken an art class, they talk about, you need to draw it like this certain way. There's a certain way that they teach you how to do faces in art classes, and I will tell you that the way that they teach you how to draw faces in art classes is 100% wrong, pretty much. I remember I was in an art class in my high school, and they were like, we're going to do faces, and you draw faces like this way, and I was like, that is not at all how you draw faces. That's how you draw faces if you want your faces to look like some kind of freak troll monster. That's not how you draw faces. There's a way you draw faces, and it has to do with construction. There's a way you kind of construct the face that we're going to be discussing. I'm also going to talk to you about doing hands, because hands are very complicated for a lot of people, and they're not that easy for me either, but I do have quite a few tricks I can teach you on how to get the shapes of the hands correct, and how to get the shading right, how to break down the groups of that. But as I said, each of those are going to be their own separate videos because there's so much to actually talk about with each of those components. And the reason that I was doing this video first, as I said, the rough work, is because doing construction, the concept of constructing from the ground up, this idea I want you to have in your head of what construction is very important because it will be the basis of all my future advice as far as like headshots, hands, feet, body, everything. There's certain ways that I construct each of those pieces so that I get the details right. And if you don't understand what construction is, it's going to be very difficult for you to understand how I'm doing what I'm doing. What I mean when I'm saying, I'm going to group it this way or that way. You need to understand that there are these groupings that you need to be aware of. They can be, some of these groupings, they're mechanical, some of them are muscular, some of them are bones. The body has a lot of groups. Anyway, that's about all I think we need to discuss for today. I know we didn't probably go over all that much, but hopefully I'll be able to get a video out on how to do headshots very soon. I don't know when, but hopefully very soon. Like I said, there's a lot of groupings in the face that I have to go over, like why those groupings are there. But that's about all that I have for today. I hope it was helpful to some of you that are very new to art. Like I said, I think in the previous episode, we're kind of starting from the very, very bottom and moving up, just the very bare basics. So if some of you out there have had some experience with art and already know about things like construction and that sort of thing, and this is all just sort of a retread of things you already know, I'm sorry, but I'm doing this from the ground up so that if there's somebody out there who is watching this who knows absolutely nothing about art, they have a starting point before we actually get into some of the more detailed parts. So anyway, that's all I have for now. I'll see you guys in the next one.